Everybody, thanks for coming along and braving what is apparently a rainy night, some stormy night now. Well, welcome to Summerhall and to our third clips screening of this academic year. This programme is part of the programme that we run from the Artist Rooms Research Partnership. Runs out of History of Art in the Edinburgh College of Art, ECA. It's a partnership with several other universities, including Glasgow and Newcastle. And the Clips programme is a film screening programme of films made by artists in the collection. So the collection comprises, I think we're on 40 artists still. I haven't done a count recently. I think the last one to come in was Philip de Barlow, so it might be on 41. We have shown, I think we'll have shown 12 films by 12 artists by the time we get to the end of the programme. And so we've done, I think, we'll have done some of 18 or 20 cafes. Now the cafes, if you haven't been, are public discussion events of individual artists in the collection. And we've got one of those coming up tomorrow at Edinburgh Sculpture Workshop about Ron Mueck, or however you say his name. And that's going to be a new venture for us, working with the Sculpture Workshop. And there are some tickets available for that if you fancy joining us. This evening, we're looking at a film by Gilbert and George. And we have two people to help us to think about this film and stimulate some controversy. We had some controversy last time when we looked at Lawrence Wiener. And two people from opposite ends of the career spectrum, we'd say. So our first speaker who's going to introduce the film is the fantastic Daisy Silver, who is a fourth year MA Fine Arts student. So an undergraduate student at the University of Edinburgh College of Art, who makes all kinds of works of art, don't you? Of various kinds, and you can find out about them if you look on our Facebook page. There's a link to her website thing, isn't there? So Daisy has been working with us, writing short texts that go on the Tate website. We call them summary texts on individual works, and she's been working with Gilbert and George, so she's now an international expert on Gilbert and George. So she's going to introduce the film, and then after we've seen the film, David Hopkins, who's a professor of art history at the University of Glasgow. Some of you may have come across him before because he spoke at our Damien Hirst event last September. David will wrap up and stimulate some arguments about this film at the end, and he may do some of his musical songs as well if you encourage him. So I'm going to hand over to David.
So for this short introduction, I hope to give a bit of insight into the artists Gilbert and George before we begin the film. So to begin, Gilbert and George wrote and directed The World of Gilbert and George in 1981. The film affirms the importance the East End of London has played in their art making, and somewhat voyeuristically provides us with an interesting glimpse into the lives of this unique and strange art duo. So Gilbert and George met in 1967 while studying sculpture at St. Martin's School of Art in London. Coincidentally, this was the same year that homosexuality was decriminalised in the UK. At that time, artists such as Richard Long, Barry Flanagan, and Bruce McLean were studying underneath Anthony Caro in the sculpture department at St. Martin's. Caro's approach to student critiques often dealt in formal terms, discussing shape and material rather than the meaning underpinning these choices. So it was early on that Gilbert and George rebelled against this institutional philosophy. Their solution was to abandon physical object sculpture altogether and to declare that they themselves would become the sculpture. Instead of creating by carving or modeling, they would present themselves as living sculpture. So their performance, the singing sculpture, which they presented as early as 1969, featured Gilbert and George as living sculpture, standing together on a table with faces painted with metallic paint, and with only a tape recorder, a walking stick, and a single glove as props, the artist physically embodied notions of sculpture. They achieved this by presenting themselves as rigid and hollow men, devoid of personality and emotion. The pair would then dance and sing the Flanagan and Allen song, Underneath the Arches, an early 1930s song sung by two homeless men who romanticized sleeping on the streets. And when the song would finish, either Gilbert or George would mechanically step down from the platform, rewind the tape, and the routine would begin again. So this entrancing spectacle repeated for about 5 minutes in its early versions. However, in later renditions, for example in Dusseldorf, the performance lasted 8 hours. So it's in these later performances that we see one of the defining characteristics of Gilbert and George's art practice, their almost frightening focused sense of purpose. When they decided to become living sculpture, they approached such an endeavor as if they were entering a religious order. But the consequence of this strict lifestyle is that the artists grew further apart from art society and society as well. So while Underneath the Arches is certainly not an autobiographical song, the song pointedly identifies with society's outcasts, and also perhaps with Gilbert and George's own self-inflicted alienation. Art historian Brenda Richardson has made some interesting comparisons between Gilbert and George's living sculpture and past examples of similar transformations of man to sculpture and vice versa. This transformation has in fact been a reoccurring theme in arts and literature since Greek mythology. The mythic sculptor of Cyprus, Pygmalion, carved an ivory statue of a woman that he found so beautiful he asked Aphrodite to bring her to life. And also in modern history, the reverse transformation occurred in 19th century France with a phenomenon called tableau vivant. In front of an audience, actors or models would carefully pose unmoving against a background scene to create a living image. And then more recently, in the 1982 English film by Peter Greenaway, The Draftsman's Contract, statues appear and reappear throughout the film as human garden sculpture. So this plot device is actually in fact based on a 17th century English phenomenon where art was more expensive than physical labor. So because of this, landowners, rather than spending money on commissioned bronze garden sculpture, would employ country folk to coat themselves in soot and to pose as living statues. In The Draftsman's Contract, most of the main characters are unaware that the statues are fake, allowing the lower class living statues an unobscured view into the lives of the gentry. So it's worth noting the interesting parallels between this historical approach to art making and Gilbert and George's own living sculpture. Both strongly identify with a working class background, and in both instances we are presented with living sculpture simultaneously entertaining and deceiving a genteel audience. Appearing to be on display, perhaps the living art is the observer, and the audience may be the real work of art, existing for the viewing pleasure of the sculptures. Both question what is real and what is contrived. So as Gilbert and George continued these performances, they realized that they can only reach handfuls of people at a time through this medium. As such, they began to work more with photography and film to expand their potential audience. Interestingly, every negative taken by Gilbert and George has been captured within walking distance of their studio home, an 18th century row house on Fournier Street in East London. This residence would prove to be fundamental in the development of their art. So, as you're about to see in the world of Gilbert and George, that even within this restricted geography, the artists are able to capture a broad range of human experiences. George has explained that there's nothing that doesn't happen in the world that doesn't happen in the East End. And they've also been quoted saying, "We would die if we had to live in West London." Art historian Michael Bracewell has suggested that Gilbert and George's interactions with London are similar to that of Charles Dickens. Like Dickens, Gilbert and George explore London through its outcasts and its lonely, and yet are able to transform this view into a romantic vision. When they moved to Fournier Street, the house was derelict. They had chosen a district of London that was simultaneously ancient and yet on the verge of modernity. The tall, sombre 18th century homes of Fournier Street were only a few blocks away from new, blank, brutalist city office buildings. This juxtaposition can be seen immediately in the opening scene of The World of Gilbert and George. The camera pans from atop a roof over this contradictory and diverse architecture. So this comparison would be an enduring component of their work. So, through their recording and capturing of London, it has always been important to Gilbert and George that their work be honest. They believe that art should deal with the entire spectrum of human motivation, whether admirable or not. In essence, everything is a potential art subject. Their dedication to honesty has compelled Gilbert and George to include drinking and getting drunk as a theme in their art. In an interview with Michael Bracewell, again, Gilbert and George explained that in the early 1970s art scene, artists would go out and get drunk at night, and then in the morning they would create these tidy geometric works in the studio. And to Gilbert and George, this orderly work contradicted the artist's messy, drunken antics from the night before. They felt these weren't accurate portrayals of the artist's experiences. So it's for this reason that Gilbert and George have touched on social issues, artistic taboos, and even excrement in their work. Their art speaks openly of their lives with unmediated self-exposure in a society that pointedly admires reservation. In The World of Gilbert and George, their direct and honest approach is evident. The film gives us a glimpse into the lives of this odd art pair. Their poetic narration combines with vivid imagery of city streets, church spires, aimless young boys, and alcoholics. And in conjunction with these images of East London, they present English symbols and songs, including one scene where the iconic patriotic song, Rule Britannia, is played as a British flag ripples in the wind. Gilbert and George once said that this film contains all of our thoughts, feelings, hopes, dreads, dreams, loves, nightmares, disasters, prophecies, memories, and tears. While this may seem ambitious, you may find that the artists are able to capture this broad range of emotions in The World of Gilbert and George. Thank you.
David Hopkins is just going to say a few things to stimulate our thoughts, and there'll be an opportunity for us to have a discussion about the film.
Okay.
David.
Well, I hope I can stimulate thoughts. I don't know. I haven't got a sort of organised argument about this really, but just several ideas really. First of all, thinking about them as Gilbert and George as artists, I had sort of two words really. One was boys and one was boys. So you move from boys to boys here, I think. By which I mean the following. I think really for ambitious artists of this period, in the 1960s, when they were students at St Martin's Art School in London, the example of Joseph Beuys would be a very compelling one. If you weren't interested in a kind of formal modernist art, such as they were taught, for instance, at St Martin's by someone like Anthony Caro, who was making these kind of sculptures which are all about purely kind of visual things such as kind of shape and colour and so on. If you weren't interested in those values, which although they were trained as sculptors, but they wanted something rather different. And if you wanted something different, you might well go to the example or look to the example of someone like Joseph Beuys, who was a major figure of this period. And the Beuys slogan was something like, he was very concerned with the idea of social sculpture, for instance, and this is the kind of notion that somehow art can be somehow made available to everybody in some sort of way, almost like almost like a pseudo-religion or something. I see a very strong strain of that in this work, but of course in a very, very English context, even to the extent that in the when they did their famous singing sculpture piece of 1969, I think it was Nigel Greenwood's gallery. they put on this metallic paint on the face, which was exactly the thing that Boyce had done earlier in one of his famous pieces, How to Explain Paintings to a Dead Hair. So that would be one way of looking at the work, and in that sense, the artist for Boyce is a kind of shaman figure who takes on social responsibility. A shaman in a sort of tribe is somebody who somehow manifests, often in quite bizarre behaviour, if you like, the concerns of the community. That would be the sort of, broadly speaking, I think the function of a shaman in a kind of tribal community. It was certainly the sort of notion of the artist that Boyce wanted to promote, and I think you can see something of that in Gilbert and George. But of course they're not shamans in a kind of wild sense. They are reserved English, well, they parody, I think, the sort of Edwardian gentlemen, possibly, in their art suits. That's what they call their, the suits they wore, the suits of responsibility, suits of social responsibility, yeah? But they would enact, as it were, these kind of strange, bizarre kind of concerns, if you like, of the modern world. And in that sense, I think function as shamans. That's just one point of view, right? Second thought, just a couple of dates. The film was made in 1981. I think Thatcher came to power in 1979. That's when the film was made, but their careers effectively began in 1969 with the singing sculpture, and that was the year after Enoch Powell made his very famous speech in Birmingham of 1968, the famous Rivers of Blood speech, in which he initiated a whole kind of era of Tory concern about the rising tide of immigration in Britain at the period. Of course, an issue which is still very much with us, and one thing that I thought throughout this was how absolutely relevant the work seems all of a sudden again. Yeah. So I would see this also as some kind of historical reflection, really, of the sort of concerns with national identity, with race, with rising sort of the sort of combatant youth culture, if you like, of the period, the rise of the National Front. All of that, of course, intermixed with a kind of very, very strong sort of homoerotic, gay subtext. That's all I've got to say. Over to you. Do you think that's right? Any of that?
Yeah, I thought that was very interesting, especially the bit about the comparison between Boyce and Gilbert and George.
Yeah.
There's a boys' show coming up
is
this
there?
summer, at Scottish National Gallery of Modern Art. There's going to be a big boys' show, and there's going to be a small show about Richard DeMarco and Boyce in the Keeler Library.
Of course, DeMarco was instrumental in bringing Boyce to Scotland,
exactly,
wasn't he? Of course.
Exactly. So he's a sort of presiding figure.
Yeah.
Does anyone want to ask any questions or make any other observations about the film?
Can you tell me, were they explicit in saying they were demonstrating a sense of the voice of society? Because it's also possible to read it as just an existential statement.
Yes.
Human emptiness, of nothingness.
I quite agree, although I think sometimes that's a sort of slightly parodic thing in the work. I mean, I suppose one other thing that occurred to me was how are we supposed to read this? Are we going to, are we I mean, this is what you're getting at, I think. Are we meant to read it as an account of suffering, if you like, which of course has got quite strong Christian overtones and so on, which came over in the film, or are we to see what they're doing very often as a sort of parody in some way, as if and so how do we read their position anyway? I mean, that seems to be one of the problems that they're presenting us with.
It reminded me very much of T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland.
Yeah, sure, absolutely, I agree.
You did say they were hollow.
Hollow men, leaning together.
They definitely embody that.
Yeah.
Any other observations, disagreements?
You mentioned Dickens earlier on,
Yeah.
and I wondered, another earlier social commentator was 18th century prints, Hogarth, print culture, you know, drunken people. Does that resonate? Is there any? Can you make connections, or is that not appropriate?
Potentially. I don't actually know much about Hogarth, so...
Yeah, Rake's Progress.
Yes.
Gin Lane, Rake Progress, yes.
Yeah.
Do you
Yes.
think that might have been in their awareness when they made the film?
Probably, and I think the fact that it's London, you know, and they're very concerned with London in that piece, aren't they? That was one thing that occurred to me. You kept seeing these kind of images of redolent of, you know, London and, you know, the kind of Tower Bridge and, you know, the Tower of London and so on. And then, of course, those shots were intercut with images of sort of change and so on. There's a sort of anxiety, I think, in the work about change. I mean, in that sense, you know, as kind of modernists, well, are they modernists? That's another question, you know. It seems to me, yeah, a kind of, the work actually deals with a kind of anxiety, which might be their anxiety, but it might be some sort of social anxiety, in the sense that Britain is going through, you know, certain kind of shifts at this time, possibly shifts of identity and national, how Britain understands itself, as it were. Does that make any sense?
Why do you suppose they dress so very traditionally in smart British suits? We once saw them in Palma. We were on holiday
right.
about 5 years ago, I suppose, and they were instantly recognisable that they were going to be there. And it certainly wasn't the reason that we went. But when we saw them together, we both said, "Oh, that's Gilbert and George, it has to be." And we then found out that there was an exhibition that they were setting up. So I'm intrigued by the fact that they are so very establishment in their appearance.
Well, they did say they wanted to be artists that moms could be proud of. So potentially that's one reason. And I guess to be distinct is another reason, to be different from the 1960s crowd that was at St. Martin's at that time.
Well, it's a very distinctive brand, isn't it?
Yeah.
It is a kind of
Very.
image that works really powerfully.
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean this brand identity almost is there from quite early on, I think, and I mean you can see them. That's why, in a way, it's interesting to see them next to someone like Beuys or Andy Warhol, for that matter, or someone like Gerhard Richter. There are only a few of these people, really, who are that identifiable, really, in the sort of post-war period, I think. And they're one, or two, if you want to call them that. Yeah, I agree. They're photo pieces as well. I mean, once you've seen one, you know, I mean, the style, you know, it's very, it kind of impresses itself in your mind, doesn't it? And you remember.
Yeah, I was talking about seeing that exhibition at the Hayward Gallery. I can't remember what year it was. It was like 87 or 88. When the Hayward Gallery line was completely stripped bare. So you know, normally when you go to exhibitions at the Hayward, there's lots of design installation. They build walls all over the place. It was just stripped bare, just bare concrete with those enormous photo reels that were, you know, full of very hard-hitting content. And it was and again going back to your sort of the British political context, that was a particularly on the back of a particularly tense period. Where there'd been, you know, riots, Liverpool riots, and Nottingham Carnival, and so on and so forth, and you know, it had they're very prepared, aren't they, to confront these kind of this sort of unconscious in British culture. You know, I like the war memorial, the sort of homoerotic photography of the war memorials and the marching soldiers, and then the skinheads. You know, these kind of transitions in the film. All those juxtapositions.
Sure. I don't know. Sometimes, but to go back to the image of you know, these almost like Edwardian, I think, gentlemen, that kind of thing. You get the sense sometimes that they are. It's almost like sort of. I once described this, but I don't think it's that accurate, really. As kind of philanthropists or something, you know, kind of visiting the city, looking around, you know, to see what the conditions are, you know, and as rather this very gentlemanly, slightly removed way. Do you understand? I mean, of course, the irony being, of course, that they're just really quite young men, but they assume a position of some sort of age and dignity and some remove from what's going on around them, which is rather interesting. And that's always internal to the work. I mean, just as in the photo pieces, very often they stand as witnesses to certain kinds of, social life, and, tramps, for instance. Or there's a famous piece called, a very racist piece potentially, called Paki, where they are standing on either side of an Asian guy. Yeah, and that was a very controversial piece. But once again, they're in the position of witnesses, internal to the work, so to speak, witnessing something. But at the same time, there's some kind of sense of remove from the thing. I'm sure there are lots of precedents in art history for exactly that kind of, framing, as it were, of the artist in a certain, context.
Yeah, they seem to be presenting themselves as part of. They had bought into the world they were describing. They had sold out. They weren't separate from it. They were actually representatives of the thing they were describing, the emptiness, the distance, the hollowness of it.
I agree, but still somewhat separate, as it seems to me, in this sense of them as being responsible witnesses or something, who are vehicles by which we have some grasp of reality or social reality in some kind of strange way. But I still see this as parodic somehow. I mean, I'm not taking any of this. I'm saying all this to you, but I don't really believe it, because there's always some element of humour and parody going on in the work, so that you don't really quite know what their position is ultimately. I mean, if they were really witnesses, and they were somehow responsible and so on, then we would assume that they have a kind of moral position, or and something. But I'm not sure that they do have, and that's another a very compelling thing about the work, I think, actually.
I wondered about hope. Is there hope? I mean, you made the link to Boyce, and Boyce was very much about healing.
Yes,
and this concept of the social sculpture should eventually make society better. Is there hope in there? You talked about humour, and that's certainly there and alleviates bleakness, but is it getting better?
I could take a vote on hope. Yeah, I don't know. I don't. I mean, you might have got from what I just said that I can't really see that there's a very distinct attitude in the work, actually, on their part. There are kind of images of redemption, aren't there? And there are kind of there's a religious iconography that's put in front of you. But then, of course, one sees a cross 1 minute, and the next minute you see, a skinhead or something, or images of violence and antagonism and so on. And so you can't really sort of work out exactly what their position might be on that. There's possibly hope in young boys, I would say. The boy at the end on the cross, effectively, but also against a flag, nationalist English St George flag. I would say there's a redemption for them in young boys. That's going from boys to boys again. Seems to frame it quite well, really. Sorry. I don't know. Did you feel there was any hope?
I feel like they show these images just as they are to present them. They're kind of observers, wanderers in this in this East London where they live, and I feel like that there is no judgment. They're not there to judge. They show these people, but they're not saying, oh, this is bad, this is good. They're just saying this is how it is, which is interesting.
They're a product of that, or in spite of that. I mean, have they become who they are because of that, or in spite of that? Because they're out with the mainstream of society in one sense, but in another sense they're very much part of it with their suits and all the rest of it, and their
beauty and tradition,
and their behaviour and all the rest of it. And yet, obviously, they were quite out there when at the time, being homosexual and things, when it wasn't accepted.
Yeah, that's another point. When was the Homosexuality Act passed? You said.
I don't actually. Oh, it was 1967. Yeah.
Yeah. The work it comes just after that, really. That's very interesting. Yeah.
But even recently, in a Tate interview that they did, which was at the retrospective, which I can't remember the exact year it was, but even then charges of being homosexual still hadn't been cleared for a lot of people.
Yeah. I mean, obviously that's a very, very important part of the work. I mean, I was thinking at one point that in a sense you could talk about it as an allegory of repressed homosexuality in a certain kind of way. I don't know if I really want to go on with that sort of thing, but it did occur to me at one time that they act precisely as it were, slightly kind of held back, repressed, homosexual. And they're coming out in a sense, of course, but also, there's the mechanical nature and the robotic nature of their actions and so on. In other words, they never fully come out into the open, so to speak. Okay, but it's very, very much aware of what's involved here. And the Bendit sequence, for instance. Do you know who Bendit was by? Isn't it Davy, Dozy, Beaky, Mick and Titch? God. Wow. I'm keeping Alzheimer's at bay. This is wonderful. I just couldn't remember early on, but now, yeah, that's right. I forget things. That's right. They did this record. That's what they were dancing to. In a way which, I mean, was they were mimicking a kind of lovemaking, I think, effectively, weren't they? You know what I'm saying, don't you? But of course, in that extremely staccato kind of cold way, I think it was very interesting. I mean, do you see what I'm saying? I mean, does anybody want to pursue that?
The beautiful thing on it, from where I was standing, was the boy who'd been naked after they put trousers on him. And
Yeah.
he was laughing.
Yes, that was great, wasn't it? At the end, I agree.
Just
Yeah,
delightful.
it was. Yeah, that was nice.
And the boy who said eating.
Yeah, he was good, wasn't he? I noticed that one of his interests was politics. A bit different to the others in that respect, wasn't he? He was a bit more thoughtful, maybe.
I thought a lot of those subsequent so-called young British artists are imitating elements of the sort of staging, like the figures talking, like the Gillian things or whatever. You felt that you could see how what they did was
Massively.
quite important for that slightly younger generation.
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
I like the repetition quite a lot, how they use that throughout, and I guess the dancing element, it does that, but also when they were speaking it, and that really changed. Like the guy at the end with the cross earring, and I couldn't tell if he was like swearing or if he was praying, or he came across at one moment he's like quite like an innocent boy, and then the next he's like a punk, and I thought they played with that a lot. I thought, like,
Yeah.
do they do that a lot in their work? I don't know their work so much. Playing with like repetition of words and actions
Images.
and movement. Yeah, I think they do in certain
And
pieces.
some of those kind of photo things, I think, there's single words written, the same word be written twice or something,
Yeah.
scum or something.
That's right. There's a lot of rhyming and repetition. Those are sort of formal devices which you could link to other kind of precedents in art and so on. Actually, with the film, I thought it was actually very, very formally kind of arranged. It was quite circular in lots of ways. There were a lot of repetition of images. There was the arms, for instance, like this. I remember at the screen at one point, and then later on in the film, you saw flowers, like that. You see, and there were lots of those kinds of devices used. I mean, you could actually analyse that in a quite abstract way, and in fact, you could actually see it as sculptural in a certain sense. I think it's a sculptor's film. There were times when they were just simply looking out of the window and naming things. I can't remember what the things were now, but the roof, or you know what I mean, rhododendron, asbestos. And you suddenly were aware that they're making you kind of think visually about things, or simply looking at their environment in a certain way, and so it could be seen as quite sort of reflective and sort of attentive to the world. At times very quiet, wasn't it? When they were just sitting in the space in the room, and
There was a striking absence of narrative, and
sure.
I mean, it was like a sculptor
Yeah.
giving the present.
Yeah.
Rather than running a story.
Yeah. And there were times, of course, they played the connoisseur, the terracotta vase conversation. I thought that was one of the best bits for me, about whether they should go and buy a terracotta vase.
I thought it was quite, I think your comparison with boys is quite interesting in the sense of the kind of human interaction and the conversation in the film, actually, like how they're kind of, so Gilbert and George have these really sort of deadpan, banal conversations about things,
Yes.
and then their sort of interviews with the sort of young boys are much more kind of natural and kind of sort of realistic. And the comparison with boys I find kind of interesting because he sort of famously would do these kind of 8-hour lectures or 6 to 8 hour lectures. And one person I think actually once said, you know, this isn't actually very democratic of you because you're the one with the microphone. And they sort of tried to banish the microphone, actually ended up staying in the end, particularly for his sort of tape lectures. And I was just wondering what you thought in terms of the sort of democracy almost of the Gilbert and George piece, because they're sort of having these almost like Beckett-esque conversations, which just, well then, are they even conversations? Because they're so banal, but then the other people in the film kind of get more of a voice.
Yeah, I don't quite know where. You were saying how does that compare with Boyce in some way? That Joseph Boyd. I don't quite know.
I don't know much about Gilbert and George, so it's kind of new to me. Well, I was just, I guess I was wondering about kind of what their idea of sort of human interaction, and which obviously they use a fair bit with there being a pair of them, and what that's kind of trying to say about London and sort of climate of the time.
It's a big question. I don't know if I can just. I don't. I mean, but I can't. As I said earlier, I can't personally find. I can't see exactly what they're trying to say to us. If you see what I mean. Yeah. I don't think they are just trying to say any one thing. I think the Boyce. To go back to this point about Boyce, which we could explore a bit more. I'm sure there's lots more to say about it. Is this that it's a certain model of the artist whereby the artist is. I try to use the shaman thing, which I think that's the best way of explaining it, because this is something the Boyce talked about. He wanted to. He saw himself in some way as a kind of shaman, right? Absurd as it might seem to some people. And that's of course why Boyce gets a lot of flack these days, because he's kind of, it's almost like seen as a sort of pseudo-spiritualism. But he was very serious about it, and I think in a way you should take it very seriously, this position, and particularly in the context of post-war Germany, right? But if you wanted to take that model, which I suspect was very, very attractive to them, then you would have to translate it. You know, you have to make it meaningful in Britain, yeah. And I think you could only probably do that in a sort of ironic way. I mean, there would be, you know, and perhaps this is some clue as to the irony involved here. That on the one hand, they adopt the repressed, you know, kind of persona of the Englishman, you know, right? But this person, they are able to, you know, kind of summon up our demons for us. Do you see what I mean? That's their responsibility. They are in their responsibility suits. That was the point I was making. I'm sure you could run with that one a bit. That was the voice analogy, anyway.
I'm mindful of the fact that probably people are getting hungry or freezing, and so we should probably wrap up. I know that Dave and Daisy would be very pleased to talk some more if people wanted to chat to them after. I'd like to thank them very much for